When the storm knocked out power across the neighborhood, emergency systems were supposed to kick in. Mine did. For exactly 6 minutes. Then, in the middle of the chaos, my house went dark, my internet died, and my surveillance cameras flatlined. I sprinted outside in the torrential rain, slipped face-first into a flower bed, and found my fiber line flopping around like a beheaded snake. The cord had been cleanly sliced, with a bright orange HOA sticker left behind like a victory flag. That's when it hit me. They didn't just cut my internet. They cut the lifeline for the local fire station, hospital, police precinct, and half a dozen emergency monitoring sites. And they had no idea I was the one who owned the tower feeding the entire block. Not the cable company. Not the city. Me. It had all started with a ridiculous complaint about aesthetics. My rooftop had a slim black relay dish barely larger than a pizza pan. Tucked between solar panels, you'd miss it unless you climbed a ladder and squinted from Karen's window with a pair of binoculars, which, unfortunately, is exactly what Gloria Hensley, the self-declared queen of the HOA, did every Saturday morning. She once left a handwritten note in my mailbox that said, "Your roof looks like a launch pad for NASA. Kindly normalize it." I had laughed at the time. But now I wish I had taken it as the warning it truly was. I moved into this gated community for peace and quiet after a burnout-fueled exit from the tech industry. My plan was simple: grow vegetables, ride out the economic storm, and keep maintaining the private tower I built just outside city limit. That tower was my baby. It had a secure fiber backbone, a high-frequency microwave array, and connected critical response systems with backup data for the fire department, police grid, even a few school buses running GPS. All under government contracts. What it also did was provide me a direct line of service with speeds most residents could only dream of. I never advertised it, never bragged. I just minded my business and lived below the radar. Until Karen decided to pull the plug. Literally. The morning of the storm, dark clouds rolled over the valley like a slow-motion tsunami. I had already locked everything down: battery backups, surge protectors, sub-pump systems for the crawlspace. I even made coffee early in case the power flickered. I was halfway through fixing a broken drawer when I noticed a red blinking alert on my laptop. Connection interrupted. I frowned. Everything in my house ran off my custom node: Wi-Fi, smart lights, thermostat, door locks. The signal wasn't just weak. It was gone. First, I rebooted the system. Nothing. Then I checked the internal log. No software errors. Only physical disconnection. That's when I knew something external had happened. I grabbed a rain jacket and jogged outside. That's when my foot caught the edge of the planter, and I skidded straight into mud and begonias. Half angry, half soaked, I pulled myself up and walked to the utility junction on the side of the house. The protective box was open. The wires were slashed. Not just unplugged, cut. Someone had actually taken a blade to it and taped an HOA infraction notice inside. The reason? Unauthorized equipment violating architectural standard. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't have the energy to scream. Who cuts a data line during an emergency storm warning? Who thinks slapping a violation sticker on a fiber optic cable in a neighborhood with 2 elderly residents on oxygen is a power move? Gloria Hensley. The HOA's walking disaster in pearl earrings. I rushed back inside and fired up my emergency satellite console. Not for personal use, but to check diagnostics on my tower. The storm had slowed the connection, but I was still able to tap into the logs. Every endpoint was fine, except mine. Worse, 2 of the local emergency nodes were now showing as unreachable. That meant Karen hadn't just taken me offline. She'd crippled part of the emergency fallback system. And there was a very real chance people could get hurt because of it. That's when the calls started. First, it was Brian from the fire station. Their incident response software had stopped syncing. Then Lieutenant Singh from the precinct texted me in all caps, "Bro, we lost the feed. You good?" Last was a quiet call from Dr. Patel at County General. She asked if I could help restore the backup telemetry connection they relied on during power loss. I swallowed hard and told them all the same thing. The HOA shut me down. I'll fix it. Give me until noon. I wiped the rain off my face and walked through my office, flipping switches on the backup gear. Normally, I'd just plug in a portable generator, reroute traffic through a temporary node, and climb back into bed with a sandwich and a movie. But not today. Today I was angry. Today the rules changed. You see, I never told anyone in this neighborhood that I own the transmission tower 12 miles east, the one everyone thinks belongs to a telecom company. I designed it. I funded it. I licensed it. And when I left the corporate world, I made sure I retained one thing: the ability to flip every switch from my phone, including the one that controls who gets signal and who doesn't. By noon, the storm had intensified. Roads were flooded. Power lines down. The HOA office was closed. No one wanted to be there with the wind howling through the windows. But Karen? Oh, she was active. She'd posted on the community app, "Attention, unapproved rooftop device has been disabled for non-compliance. Internet restoration underway. Please be patient." I stared at her post, trying not to hurl my coffee. She had no idea what she had actually done. She thought I was some stubborn homeowner with a boosted router, not the architect of the entire grid she just wrecked. As I waited for the city to greenlight my restoration protocol, I checked the legal logs. My equipment was registered under the Emergency Technology Cooperative Act. That meant it was exempt from local interference. In fact, tampering with it could trigger a federal investigation. Which meant, technically, Karen might have just committed a felony with a pair of hedge clippers. That was the moment the gears in my mind clicked. This wasn't just personal. It was strategic. And I was about to turn her entire smug operation into a cautionary tale for the ages. I drafted an official report, complete with timestamps, geopings, and damage assessment. I sent it to the city's emergency coordinator, the local precinct, and one contact I hadn't used in years, my friend Anika at Homeland Security's Infrastructure Division. She owed me a favor. When she saw the footage and the report, she replied with one sentence: "We'll take it from here." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind hammering the side of my house. Somewhere across the neighborhood, Karen was probably sipping chamomile tea, completely unaware that she hadn't just snipped a cable. She'd flipped the switch on a series of events that would expose her, humiliate the HOA, and remind everyone that messing with the quiet tech guy next door wasn't just foolish, it was catastrophic. The storm continued to rage through the next morning, but I was already 2 steps ahead. By sunrise, I'd patched a temporary uplink to my tower using a high-frequency bypass. It wouldn't bring full service back, but it was enough to monitor incoming traffic and keep key emergency pings online. That's when I got the call I was expecting, or maybe dreading. Fire Chief Donovan's voice came through with the intensity of someone who hadn't slept. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He jumped right in, asking why their backup coordination system had gone down. I calmly explained that my rooftop node had been forcibly disabled by the local HOA. There was a long pause on the other end before he muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." I wish I was. After hanging up, I slipped into dry clothes and drove toward the HOA community center. Roads were slick, branches scattered everywhere, and the stoplights blinked yellow. When I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, there were a dozen residents standing outside, clutching umbrellas and looking agitated. Apparently, I wasn't the only one with questions. I walked right past them and into the main lobby, where Karen was seated at her usual desk with her tiny dog nestled in her lap, peering at me like it knew I was trouble. She looked up with her trademark smirk, the one that screamed fake professionalism. "I see you've come to discuss your violation," she said, tapping her pen on a form. I didn't sit. I just leaned across the desk and asked her, point blank, who gave her authority to tamper with a federal data line. Her pen paused mid-stroke. Karen adjusted her glasses and replied in that condescending tone she reserved for people she thought she could bully. Sir, your equipment was not filed with the Architectural Review Committee and does not comply with our guidelines. Therefore, action was taken to bring your home into compliance. I asked her if she knew what a Class 3 protected transmission node was. She blinked. I asked if she knew what agency her little stunt might have violated. She blinked again. Then she waved her hand like she was swatting away a fly and said something about how rules are rules. That's when I pulled out my phone, opened the diagnostics file, and showed her the impact of what she had done. Not just knocking my house offline, but triggering cascading failures to local response systems. Her smile faltered just a hair. I told her, very plainly, that her actions didn't just violate HOA policy, they breached a federal telecommunications contract. And before she could roll her eyes or dismiss me, I played the clip. It was from a neighbor's doorbell camera. In full HD, the video showed Karen, in rain boots and a raincoat, tiptoeing through my flower bed and snipping the fiber cable with a pair of hedge clippers. Clear as day. She even paused to put a violation sticker on the box before marching back toward her house. Her mouth opened slightly when she saw it, but she recovered quickly. That's out of context, she said. You cut my line in a storm, I replied. What exactly is the context that justifies that? Other board members had wandered into the lobby by then, drawn in by the commotion. I recognized Tom, the HOA treasurer, and Denise, who usually kept to herself unless money was involved. I didn't need a crowd, but I welcomed the witnesses. I pulled out a second printout, this one of the emergency network charter signed between my tower consortium and the city. The section highlighted in yellow stated explicitly that any physical interference with the emergency relay system was considered an actionable offense. Denise's eyes widened. Karen's dog yapped. And Tom asked the question that should have been asked from the beginning, why didn't we know about this? Karen jumped in, insisting that I had failed to disclose my equipment, that I'd hidden it behind solar panels to avoid detection, that this was a matter of deception. I turned to the group and calmly explained that my system had been in place for over a year, filed directly with the city, and exempt under municipal emergency planning statute. I showed them the time-stamped approval. Karen started to say something else, but Tom raised his hand and told her to stop. Then he looked at me and said, "We'll need to call a special meeting." By the time I got home, word had already started to spread. A post on the community app read, "Did the HOA cut someone's emergency cable?" Underneath, residents were chiming in. One wrote that their home security system crashed during the storm and never came back. Another said their grandmother's alert bracelet didn't go off when she fell. People were realizing this wasn't just a feud between a homeowner and a cranky board, it was a dangerous overreach. I watched the digital fire spread from one thread to another, each post fanning the flames Karen had lit with her own scissors. The next day, I received a call from Lieutenant Singh, who sounded even more exasperated than Donovan. Their precinct had reviewed logs from their remote station and determined that the interference had originated from my sector. I confirmed their findings and forwarded my own documentation. He thanked me, then paused. His tone shifted. "You realize this isn't just HOA drama anymore, right? This is about public safety." I told him I knew, and I was preparing something that would make sure it never happened again. I wasn't planning to retaliate with emotion. I was going to respond with precision. I rechecked the legal framework around my tower. While it wasn't city property, it served municipal functions. That meant it fell under a rarely used clause in the state's emergency management agreement. If anyone interfered with its operation, I could trigger a service lockdown protocol, not just for my home, but for any entity within the HOA's jurisdiction. With one call, I could reroute bandwidth to avoid the entire grid until a full investigation cleared the tampering. I sent the notice to the HOA, to the city, and to every relevant service. The language was clear. Due to deliberate interference with critical communications infrastructure, we are enacting a temporary service diversion from the affected jurisdiction to preserve system integrity and comply with federal guidelines. Effective immediately. 3 hours later, every home in the HOA lost internet. Cell service dropped to 1 bar. Digital landlines reverted to dead tones. The HOA office itself lost access to its online record. I watched from my window as Karen stood on her porch, frantically waving her phone in the air trying to find a signal. A neighbor came over yelling about his home alarm not working. Another shouted that they couldn't contact their daughter out of state. The entire neighborhood, Karen's kingdom, was suddenly back in the dark ages. And this time, it wasn't the storm's fault. It was hers. By sunset, the community center was filled with furious residents demanding answers. The board scrambled to calm everyone down, blaming a temporary city issue. But the city had already released a statement clarifying that the issue stemmed from a private service provider reacting to line tampering. That service provider, of course, was me. And I wasn't just a disgruntled homeowner. I was the architect of the invisible web that kept their digital lives running. Karen had pulled one cord. I had pulled the rest. The message was simple. If you attack the system defends itself. I didn't need revenge. I had logic. And now the entire HOA was starting to realize that their arrogance hadn't just inconvenienced one man, it had jeopardized their own safety, comfort, and credibility. The question wasn't what they would do next. It was what I would do with the power they never knew I had. The silence that blanketed the neighborhood was unnatural. No music from backyard speakers, no chatter from smart home assistants, no kids on tablets while parents zoomed from kitchen counters. Just the occasional slamming of a screen door and the rising volume of frustrated voices drifting across yards. I watched from my home office as Karen paced her porch, gesturing wildly into a phone that clearly wasn't working. I had expected confusion. What I hadn't expected was how quickly that confusion would evolve into panic. The community, so dependent on its invisible systems, was unraveling minute by minute, and Karen had no idea how deeply the damage she caused went. But I knew. I watched as my inbox flooded with messages. Some from residents begging for help. Some from city tech liaisons trying to mediate. One, from an HOA board member, simply read, "Please come to the emergency meeting tonight. We need to fix this." I didn't reply. Not yet. I wasn't done watching the effects of their ignorance. By noon, Denise from the HOA's finance committee showed up at my door, umbrella in hand, hair still damp from what must have been a chaotic board meeting. She looked tired and far less smug than usual. She asked if we could speak. I let her in, not because I cared for her company, but because I needed the rest of the board to realize I wasn't playing defense anymore. She sat on the edge of my couch and sighed like someone who'd just read their own eulogy. She started by saying that she didn't support Karen's actions. Then she said something surprising. She hadn't even known about the cable cut until residents started flooding her phone. Karen had acted alone. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was the tone in Denise's voice. It wasn't just regret. It was fear. Fear of what this was becoming. She explained that the HOA was receiving threats of lawsuit. Parents couldn't access their baby monitors. Medical devices were offline. Someone's digital lock system glitched and trapped them outside in the rain for 2 hours. Denise didn't sugarcoat anything. She said, "We're on the verge of a community-wide meltdown, and if the city gets involved legally, it's over." She then asked the question I'd been waiting for, "What do you want?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I brought up my laptop and showed her a live map of the service grid. Every red square marked a node that had lost signal due to the HOA's interference. I zoomed out. The map filled with red. Denise blinked slowly, processing what she was seeing. I explained that this wasn't just about home internet. It was about system integrity across the broader emergency response ecosystem. Then I told her what I wanted. Full written acknowledgement of HOA liability. Karen's immediate removal from any position of authority, and a signed agreement that the HOA would never interfere with any infrastructure registered under municipal or federal protection, no matter how small it looked. Denise didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "I'll bring it to the board." I told her she had until the end of the day. After she left, I checked the diagnostics again. My tower was functioning flawlessly, routing signal away from every home within HOA borders. Even the public Wi-Fi near the community center had gone dead. Not because I wanted to punish the residents, but because I had to enforce the consequences of sabotage. If the HOA could tamper with systems like mine once and walk away with a slap on the wrist, it would never stop. There had to be a line, and now they'd found it the hard way. Karen, meanwhile, had gone into full denial mode. She posted on the community board claiming that I was staging a digital rebellion and threatening cyber warfare. Her post was riddled with paranoia and half-truth. She said I was running an unlicensed tech operation and that I was manipulating city systems for revenge. That's when someone finally posted the doorbell footage. The one that showed her, in a raincoat, snipping the fiber line like a child dismantling Christmas lights. The comments that followed were brutal. One user asked if she'd like to cut the power next and see what happens when someone on life support misses a battery alert. Another offered to start a GoFundMe for the residents' therapy. My personal favorite simply said, "Congratulations, Karen, you're trending under national stupidity." That post broke the dam. More residents came forward. One elderly couple said Karen had ordered their satellite dish removed last year because it didn't match the HOA color scheme. Another shared that she fined a single mom for using a makeshift antenna during remote school sessions. It became clear that Karen had long viewed technology as some kind of visual threat to her version of order. And this time, her obsession had crossed the line into disaster. Late that afternoon, the board called an emergency meeting at the community hall. I didn't attend right away. I let them sweat a little, let them wrestle with the scale of what they'd done. When I finally showed up, the room was packed. Every seat filled. Some residents standing. The board sat up front behind a folding table, faces pale and tight with tension. Karen wasn't in her usual center chair. She was off to the side, arms crossed, eyes locked on me with pure venom. Tom, the treasurer, opened the meeting and motioned for me to speak. I stepped up with a file in one hand and a tablet in the other. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply laid out the facts. I explained the scope of the tower, its legal protections, its role in supporting not just this neighborhood, but schools, hospitals, and fire response. Then I showed them what had gone down. Camera footage, time logs, emergency service impact report. Silence filled the hall. Even Karen didn't speak. Then I opened the final document, a legal notice drafted with the help of an old law school buddy. It listed charges of property tampering, endangerment, and potential federal interference. I read the first paragraph out loud, not to threaten them, but to show how real this had become. Denise stood and whispered to Tom. He nodded. Then he turned to the residents and said, "The board accepts full liability. We will sign the agreement." And effective immediately, Gloria Hensley is relieved of her duties pending investigation. The room erupted, not in cheers but in collective relief. Someone even clapped. Karen stormed out, but no one followed. For once, the board had chosen accountability over denial. And I, in turn, gave my final word. I told them that upon confirmation of the agreement and Karen's removal, I would begin re-establishing service to the neighborhood. But not a moment before. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the last flickers of daylight fade. My phone buzzed. A signed PDF had come through. Everything I asked for. I tapped a few commands, and signal nodes began reactivating. Lights blinked across the grid. One by one, homes came back online. But I made one small change. A digital dead zone centered around Karen's address. Just a little reminder that some mistakes come with lasting consequences. The neighborhood got their signal. Karen lost her power. And I had no intention of letting either change anytime soon. The following morning brought a strange peace across the neighborhood, as if the storm had not only passed in the skies but in everyone's nerves. You could feel it in the quiet buzz of smart lights flickering back on, thermostats humming gently as homes began warming again, and the slow return of phones vibrating with notifications that had been offline for nearly 2 days. But there was one house where none of that was happening. Karen's. Her windows were dark. Her phone was dead. Her Wi-Fi was non-existent. And every attempt she made to fix it resulted in more frustration and a louder tantrum that echoed through the cul-de-sac. The digital dead zone I created wasn't just a punishment. It was a reminder. A lesson carved into bandwidth. But the ripple effect of her actions hadn't fully landed until that afternoon when the city officials arrived in suits and hard expressions, clipboards in hand. I had given them a heads-up through the proper channels that interference with emergency networks had occurred and that the involved party had a record of similar incidents going back nearly 2 years. The investigation wasn't just administrative anymore, it was structural, because what Karen disrupted wasn't just signal. She'd interfered with a pilot disaster response system embedded in the tower grid. That program was under review for potential statewide expansion, and her little act of sabotage had flagged it with a red alert. It didn't take long before things spiraled beyond her control. City inspectors showed up to the HOA clubhouse demanding access to maintenance logs, security records, and all correspondence related to technological equipment enforcement. The board tried to stall, saying everything was internal. But the city wasn't asking, they were instructing. It turns out that when an individual disables infrastructure used by law enforcement, medical emergency systems, and federal data collection hubs, it doesn't matter what kind of floral paper the notice was printed on. Karen had crossed a federal boundary, and they were digging in to see just how deep it went. Residents started whispering. A few bold ones began talking openly. At the dog park, in the community center, on neighborhood apps, people told their stories. One woman recounted how Karen had ordered her contractor to remove a satellite dish because it interfered with the look of the sky. Another revealed that Karen once tried to fine her for having a smart doorbell with too many blinking lights. These little dictatorships had always flown under the radar because no one thought they mattered. But now people saw the pattern. Karen didn't care about rules. She cared about control. And she had finally lost it. That week, the HOA board scheduled another meeting. This time, a full open-floor session with every resident invited to voice their concerns. I attended, not because I needed to be there, but because I wanted to see the unraveling happen in real time. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. Denise and Tom looked tense, their smiles thin and professional. The remaining board members sat in awkward silence. Karen, of course, wasn't present. According to the meeting announcement, she was suspended pending review and not authorized to speak on behalf of the HOA. That sentence alone drew light applause from the crowd. As residents took turns at the mic, the air thickened with long-buried frustration. People who had been too scared to complain suddenly found their voices. One man read aloud the absurd citations he'd received over the years, one for wind chime volume, another for excessive use of solar glare. A young couple explained how they'd nearly lost a home loan approval because Karen reported their smart garage door as a permanent structure violation. Someone even brought a copy of a community newsletter Karen had personally edited, where she referred to internet towers as sky trash and digital pollution. Laughter broke out, then anger, then agreement. It wasn't just about this latest disaster. It was about years of tyranny disguised as neighborhood standard. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't go to the mic. I simply stood near the back and raised my voice enough to be heard. I said that I hadn't come to gloat. I said this wasn't about revenge. This was about responsibility. The responsibility to protect vital infrastructure. The responsibility to acknowledge when boundaries are crossed. and the responsibility of every resident to stand up when something is clearly wrong. I told them that the tower would continue to serve the region, that I would continue to support emergency systems, schools, and response teams. But I warned them that if another sabotage occurred, I wouldn't just redirect the signal, I would remove the grid entirely from the neighborhood. And this time, there wouldn't be a second chance. That statement hit harder than anything else said that night. People understood now. The internet wasn't just about Netflix buffering or Wi-Fi range in their backyard. It was about safety, communication, structure. Karen's tantrum had endangered them all, and for the first time, the board and the residents were aligned on one thing: she could never be allowed to do it again. Over the next few days, things changed rapidly. Karen's name was removed from all correspondence. Her access to the HOA portal was revoked. Legal documents were quietly filed confirming her full removal from the board and any related committees. But the real blow came when the HOA's insurance provider dropped them. Apparently, once the carrier reviewed the footage and the subsequent fallout, they deemed the incident too risky to cover. Without liability insurance, the HOA couldn't operate legally. The board scrambled. Emergency meetings turned into emergency audit. Some members resigned outright. Others tried to negotiate new terms. But the damage had been done. And then came the news that shocked everyone, even me. The grant for the pilot emergency network, the one my tower helped test and support, had been revoked for the HOA jurisdiction. Not for me. Not for the city. Just for this neighborhood. The report cited localized disruption by unauthorized personnel and insufficient protection of federal emergency infrastructure. In simple terms, Karen's actions had cost the community over $200,000 in tech investment and future upgrade. It was like someone had dropped a financial bomb in the center of the neighborhood. Karen, now isolated and increasingly frantic, tried to stage a comeback. She printed letters claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. She accused me of hacking her email. She even tried to call the city and offer testimony about my equipment. But the door had closed. Public opinion had turned. The residents, once silent and scattered, were now united and informed. No one believed her. No one listened. Her voice had become static, just like the signal she once tried to destroy. I returned to my routines. Monitoring the tower. Fine-tuning the failsafe. Expanding coverage zones for rural emergency support. Occasionally, I'd walk by Karen's house and see her sitting on the porch, holding her phone up to the sky like a lost child begging the stars to give her connection. Her dead zone still held firm. It wasn't petty, it was policy. She was a risk, and the system knew it. One bad node can crash the whole network. My job was to prevent that. But in private, I also did something no one knew about. I installed a second layer of protocol. This one could re-establish connection for any home in the neighborhood within minutes, except for one address. It was silent, seamless, and permanent. A personal firewall carved not out of vengeance, but memory. So if anyone ever asked, I could say with complete honesty that the network forgave the neighborhood. But by the following week, the neighborhood had fully settled into its new rhythm. Systems were back online. Doorbells worked. Security alerts chimed gently through the night like the digital heartbeat of the street. The residents, once passive and intimidated by rules they didn't understand, had started organizing in new ways. There was now a tech subcommittee forming, volunteers who wanted to learn more about how infrastructure like mine worked, people who were curious rather than suspicious. I hadn't expected that. I figured most of them would stay quiet, just happy to have their streaming services restored. But the storm had woken something up in them, something that wasn't just about Wi-Fi or HOA politics. It was about understanding what kept their lives running and the consequences of not knowing until it was too late. One morning I got a knock on the door. It was Tom, the HOA treasurer, holding two things, a small box and a manila folder. He looked like he hadn't slept again, but there was a calmness in his posture I hadn't seen before. He handed me the box first. Inside was a simple plaque that read, "In appreciation of services rendered beyond the call of community duty." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if it was sarcastic. He quickly said it wasn't. Apparently, a vote had passed to officially recognize the role of my tower and infrastructure support as a designated community asset. I didn't even know they could do that. Then he handed me the folder, which contained a full signed agreement that cemented the new protocols we'd talked about. No one, not the board, not individual residents, not contractors, could tamper with any tech equipment or cabling within the community without written approval from a certified technician and the city's emergency coordinator. It was an HOA policy now, added to the bylaws. Permanently. I told him I appreciated it. He nodded and started to leave but paused at the door. Then he said something that caught me off guard. I always thought Karen was overbearing. But I never realized just how dangerous that kind of thinking could become. You didn't just fix the internet. You saved us from ourselves. And then he walked away. That moment stuck with me more than anything else that happened. Because it wasn't about power. It was about someone finally seeing what I saw all along, that systems fail when people don't understand the weight of what they're touching. Karen, meanwhile, had gone radio silent. No posts. No calls. No HOA appearances. She was effectively exiled, not by decree but by disinterest. People had stopped listening. Her attempts to rally support fizzled faster than wet firework. I later heard she'd tried to file a complaint against me through a third-party mediator, but the city responded with a polite but firm notice reminding her that tampering with protected infrastructure voided her credibility. That, and the fact that the HOA's own legal counsel had signed the liability acceptance, made it impossible for her to spin the narrative anymore. Her era of fear-based leadership was over. And everyone knew it. The funniest part came when a local YouTube channel that covers neighborhood controversies picked up the story. Someone had leaked the ring footage, and it was making the rounds with dramatic edits, zoom-ins on Karen's face, and sarcastic commentary layered over soft piano music. The title read, HOA Karen vs. the Internet Tower. Spoiler, she loses. It hit over 1 million views in 3 days. Commenters flooded the video with reactions ranging from disbelief to full-on satire. Memes popped up of Karen holding garden shears next to captions like Signal Slayer and Fiber Optic Assassin. It was ridiculous, but it was poetic. The public had found their villain, and this time, she wasn't escaping behind policy papers and HOA codes. Still, I kept my head down. I wasn't looking for fame or followers. I was just glad the system was back where it should be, stable, secure, respected. That weekend, the neighborhood held a small block party to celebrate what the board awkwardly called Reconnection Day. Tables lined the sidewalks, kids ran around with sparklers, and even some residents I'd never spoken to before came over to shake my hand. One man, holding a plate of ribs, said he'd lived here for 6 years and never once knew there was a private emergency grid until all this happened. Another woman hugged me out of nowhere and said her father's medical alert bracelet had started working again the day after I flipped the signal back on. It was overwhelming but grounding. It reminded me that what I built wasn't just fiber and servers. It was trust. Invisible, maybe, but essential. But fate wasn't quite done with Karen. Late one afternoon, I got an unexpected notification on my property monitoring system. A familiar address had triggered a transfer request, Karen's house. I clicked through the data trail and confirmed it. She was selling. Or more accurately, the house was being sold under pressure. Between the fines, the legal costs, and the loss of HOA protection, her grip on the property had slipped. There was even a lien filed by a third-party contractor claiming unpaid invoices for unauthorized lock replacements she'd demanded before the whole disaster unfolded. It was poetic in its symmetry. The woman who tried to control everything had lost control of her own front door. The final twist came a few weeks later. A friend of mine in real estate tipped me off that Karen's house was hitting the open market. Out of curiosity, and maybe a little mischief, I made a call. I didn't bid on it myself, but I helped arrange a quiet purchase through a trust tied to my infrastructure company. Not out of spite, but out of practicality. The property was central, had decent line of sight to the tower, and could serve as a future maintenance hub if upgraded properly. The sale went through in less than a month. Karen didn't know who bought it, and I never planned to tell her. On the day the moving truck arrived, I watched from my porch as she stood in the driveway, arms crossed, scowling at every item being packed. Her face was tight with bitterness, but her shoulders looked heavy, like the weight of everything she built had finally landed on top of her. She never looked my way. Or maybe she did and just didn't want to acknowledge what was obvious now to everyone. Her legacy wasn't community improvement. It was a case study in what happens when control becomes obsession. After the last box disappeared into the truck, she climbed into the passenger seat of an old SUV and drove off without a word. No goodbye. No apology. Just a vanishing figure in a neighborhood that had already moved on without her. I stood in the quiet, watching the signal logs refresh on my tablet. Every home glowed green. Every node stable. Every emergency system live. Karen was gone, but the lessons she left behind would linger for years. Later that evening, I walked through the neighborhood one last time before heading home. Porch lights twinkled. Laughter echoed from a backyard barbecue. A teenager zipped past me on an electric scooter streaming music from a device that would have been silent just days ago. Life had returned. Not just the signal, but the pulse of the community. And I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to threaten or bully or manipulate. I just needed to let the truth run its course, quietly, powerfully, and with absolute precision. The same way a signal moves through a line. Silent. Invisible. Unstoppable.